Welcome, everybody. I want to just express my gratitude for the opportunity to be here and speak with you. And thank you for all my friends who shut up so there was no one here. I appreciate it so much. And such an honor to be here, and such an honor to have such amazing colleagues and to be here with them, particularly Tzvi, who's just a workhorse and is really carrying so much in our community for the Jewish Orthodox community in general. And Lisa and Gavi put the program together, and Rebecca, who spoke so beautifully, and Risa, who came to join us also. And it's such an honor to be here. And as a community member of the 5 towns, I'm honored that we made an event and so many people came to find out about this very important issue. And which shows me how serious we are about our health and about our children, and not only about our children, but also about the adults in our community that are suffering from addiction. So what I wanted to do today was I really wanted to try to share with you a little bit of my view of addiction, try to give you a little bit of a helicopter view of how I see the issue. And my journey with addiction, I could tell you that my journey with addiction started 14 years ago when I was working as a Rebbe in an outpatient, in an alternative boys high school, just around the corner here in Temple Group, and which is a substance abuse treatment facility. And but really, my journey with addiction started much earlier than that. And Tzvi had mentioned this earlier. When I was living in Israel, I was in Kollel, and we had a family member who used to come for lunch. And he was in one of these programs for guys that are, abusing substances and other things. And he would come in and he showed us his NA key tag that he had 30 days or 60 days. And we didn't really know any better. And we would say things like, "Oh, okay, it's wonderful that you're not using drugs, but now come take a drink." And luckily today, that relative is a very happy, functional, successful young man with a family. But from that moment, I think maybe that was my punishment. He filled my life with working with addicts and alcoholics, and it's been my great pleasure for the last 14 years. Specifically what I do, I mentioned the living room, I'll just mention who I am, kind of what that is. The living room is a clubhouse housed in Brooklyn, New York, that serves young people all over New York, as far as Muncie and Lakewood, and everywhere in between. And we have an active membership of over 150 young adults. We have 30 couples that are in our little community. And basically what we do is we provide a community for young adults who are in recovery, give them supports, and help them connect with the supports that they need along the way. And I've been doing that for 12 years, so I have a great joy of knowing hundreds of addicts and alcoholics. And I also have the privilege of being a clinical social worker. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit of my perspective on addiction that can kind of help you have a view of it. Rebecca did a beautiful job giving you a personal snapshot of addiction, and maybe I can try to give you a little bit of my vantage point. So my objective tonight is to provide you with a little bit of framework to understand substance abuse, dependency, and addiction. And I separate all those things because people always convolute and confuse them. Right? Substance abuse is something that maybe people that are unhealthy do, and it's dangerous. And dependency is a very, very dangerous reality in our world, particularly when it comes to substances. And then finally, addiction. And you'll notice I'm making a separation between dependency and addiction, and I'm doing so semantically because it will help you later on to better understand the issue. Finally, I want to help you communicate about about these topics in a meaningful way with your families. So I'm going to try to provide you with information that will make you experts to the best of my ability in about 15 minutes. So let's first start by defining some terms. It's really important that we kind of define what we're talking about. So when we talk about substance abuse, we're talking about the use of a substance or behavior that is not medically or otherwise warranted in the pursuit of pleasure, relief, fun, etc., etc. So if someone's using drugs, that's kind of what we're talking about. So then, what is substance abuse? Substance abuse is very similar, except that it's the use of a substance that is not medically or otherwise warranted, but this is in a way that infringes on the individual's ability to function and have a successful and happy life. So anytime I am referring to substance abuse, and I think really anytime anyone's referring to substance abuse, they're talking about that. And dependency is the use of a substance or behavior as the result of a developed need for the substance or behavior, physical and or psychological, to cope or even engage in the normative functions of life, which means the person develops a need for a drug in order to kind of do regular life things, whether it's have fun or cope with challenging situations or go to work or deal with their families, etc., etc., etc. So the question is, what is addiction? We hear the word addiction all the time. What is addiction? What is an addict? So we're going to try to define that for you. The most comprehensive definition that I could think of is that addiction is a multifaceted illness and disorder, which is composed of physiological, cognitive, and developmental criteria. Addiction impacts 10 to 20% of the U.S. population and cuts across age, race, and socioeconomic spectrum. Now, normally when I do this kind of presentation, I'm speaking to a group of parents and or high school kids who are forced to be there. So I asked them to consider the fact that there's about 150 or 200 people in the room, and if 10 to 20% of the population have addiction, there's a good 10 to 20 people in the room that are addicts. And I asked them to really kind of consider that. Tonight I don't think I have to do that because if you came here, I think you have a sense of that. But just to even consider that the amount of people that are in this room and the amount of addicts that are in this room, to realize that this is an issue that's present and it's in our community, whether those addicts are in recovery or in active addiction, which we're going to talk about some of the things we can do to help those in active addiction. Now, while dependency is a prominent feature of the illness I just mentioned, the two terms are not synonymous, and that's why I kind of separated them. So let's understand addiction. So my favorite representation of addiction is our friend Cookie Monster. So everyone loves cookies. And it's not hard to imagine a person who, after having one cookie, there's some delicious cookies in the back, has a craving for more, and maybe even has 2 or 3. But let's imagine a person whose craving for cookies is so severe that they eat the whole tray. So we might call them self-indulgent. We might say that they have a lack of self-control. But imagine for a moment that this person experiences tremendous emotional distress, and that he or she only experiences relief from their distress when eating cookies, and that this distress is enhanced when he or she doesn't have their cookies, and that the shame of eating an exorbitant amount of cookies and being obese is nothing compared to the distress that they feel in their lives. Now imagine that this individual's physical craving for cookies is atypical because the craving maintains throughout. It is as strong after the 10th as it is after the 1st. Right? So what this means is if I see a tray of cookies, my brain tells me I should have a cookie. I have a craving for cookies. If I have a second cookie, it's because my brain tells me that I want a second cookie, but I'm not as hungry, so my craving is not as strong. And by the time I get to the 3rd, my belly's full, my craving for cookies is only self-indulgence. But imagine if my craving, because it's atypical, it's not the same as everybody else, is as strong at the 10th as it is for a regular person who's on a diet, avoiding one of those cookies. Now that might kind of change the equation a little bit. Suddenly, his or her lack of self-control seems like less of a factor, and our judgment of them less appropriate. For this individual, not having the 10th cookie is way more challenging than the normal individual not having the 2nd or even maybe the 1st. Self-control and willpower can only provide short-term success. Any long-term success seems to entail a life full of tension and self-restriction. Because again, they experience distress, they only feel good when they have their cookies in this imaginary person. And when they have the cookie, they feel okay, and without the cookie, they don't feel okay. And the distress that they have is way worse than any distress they have over the amount of cookies. And when they begin to eat cookies, the craving is overwhelming. This is addiction. That's what it's like to be an addict. So let's break down my earlier definition. So I said addiction is a multifaceted illness and disorder which is composed of physiological, cognitive, and developmental criteria. So what did I mean by that? So the first thing that means is that addiction does not just occur in the decision-making areas of the brain. People associate addiction as being a choice-oriented thing, meaning we make choices. I choose to eat the cookie, for example. But addiction doesn't just occur in that area. For an addict, his use of drugs is natural and instinctual. The impulse and craving for more is real and intense, and it's a physical sensation they experience in their minds and in their bodies. And finally, addiction also includes physical and psychological dependencies, where the individual experiences painful withdrawal symptoms when they don't have their drugs. Now, it's important to note, we're going to talk a lot about opiate addiction, and when somebody is an opiate addict and they don't have their opiates, then they're very, very sick. They're physically ill. But one of the things that people misassociate or they confuse is they think that that's the only form of withdrawal. But when you get to kind of know what it's like to be an addict and work with addicts, you find out that addicts that are in active addiction experience withdrawal in many other areas of themselves. They may not experience any physical withdrawal from their substance. For example, someone who's addicted to marijuana. They might not necessarily be, it's not very easy to become physically dependent upon marijuana, but it's very, very simple. It's much easier to become psychologically dependent upon marijuana. And what happens to somebody who's dependent on marijuana who doesn't have marijuana is they experience tremendous emotional distress when they don't have their marijuana. And that distress alone, aside from all the other factors that we described, compels them to use again. So what do I mean by cognitive? What I mean is this: many addicts exhibit distortions in their thought process that cause them to make some of the bad choices they make. Even when they make choices, those choices are inhibited by learned and developed cognitive patterns. These patterns make the choice not to use difficult, if not impossible. These patterns are addressed in treatment and throughout recovery. Meaning that even in the areas of the brain that relate to choice, the addict is inhibited. So he's experiencing this physical phenomenon, and he is also experiencing a reduction in his ability to choose. And finally, oops, I went too far. Finally, developmental. This one's very interesting, and I'm actually reading a fascinating book that kind of compares the experience of addicts with the autism spectrum, which is that addicts exhibit developmental delays in certain, or some addicts, many addicts, exhibit developmental delays in certain areas specifically related to emotion regulation and sensory processing. Social intelligence can also be inhibited. This further makes it difficult for them to thrive without the crutch or some sort of social lubricant. This aspect has to be addressed in their recovery and over their lives. Now, one of the things you'll find if you go to an AA meeting or an NA meeting or one of these, or any anonymous meeting, is that they have a sign on the wall, and the sign says, "Live life on life's terms." Now, for many of us, living life on life's terms is obvious. Of course I have to live life on life's terms. I can't dictate the terms of life. But for an addict, this is new information. It's an epiphany, because they don't always get that automatically. And that's the kind of like developmental thing that addicts require, sometimes just education, but also just support to kind of help them deal with those challenges or those delays, developmental delays. There's other stuff as well, like I mentioned, emotional regulation, emotion regulation, sensory regulation, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so what we have now is that an addict is dealing with all of those facets, all of those issues. And then we talked about dependency. So while dependency is a prominent feature of this illness, they are not synonymous. Many, if not most, addicts experience dependency, be it physical, psychological, or both. But not every dependent person experiences addiction in the entirety I just described. People can become dependent or addicted, in the way that we usually use the word addicted, to a drug and subject to the dangers of addiction, even though they're not an addict in the sense that we just described. The bottom line is, if someone is dependent, they need to get help and get clean. Whether they are an addict or not is something they have to figure out later. So really when we talk about Narcan, we're really talking about fighting or some other kind of intervention. We're talking about battling the acute dependency to a substance, which compels a person to use again and again and again without even having to deal with any of the other layers of issues that we talked about that relate to addiction. So what about a predisposition to addiction and dependency? Everybody always wants to know this. There's a lot of studies, and some of the things that the studies have found is that a history of mental illness, a history of learning disabilities, impulse control, thrill seekers, a family history of addictions and eating disorders, and finally victims of sexual abuse and other major life traumas seem to exhibit a predisposition to developing either dependency or addiction, or obviously both. So let's talk about the scope of the problem. And Svi mentioned some of these statistics earlier. So today, right now, in the Amudim caseload, there are 100 community members that are currently enrolled in an inpatient substance abuse setting. That's an enormous number. There are 261 cases of individuals that have completed treatment are now in early remission. Early remission is a clinical term that's used to describe someone who is between 3 months and 12 months. Before 12 months, they're not considered in remission. Between 3 and 12 months, they're considered in early remission. And sustained remission is considered over 12 months of abstinence. At the Living Room, we have an active membership of over 150 young adults actively engaged in recovery lifestyle and who have achieved sustained remission. So there's a large population and community of active addicts and recovering addicts. So substance abuse related and overdose deaths. As everyone's mentioned, the numbers are relatively unclear, but we have a good sense of the numbers, particularly because of organizations like Amudim that are doing a great job documenting all of these things. 86 people in the frum community nationally passed away from a substance abuse or overdose-related death from last Rosh Hashanah to this past Rosh Hashanah. It's an obscene number. It's well beyond anything that I've experienced in the 12 previous years that I was working in the living room in total. And then this year, since this past Rosh Hashanah, and we're only 2 weeks short of, a week and a half short of Hanukkah, the community's experienced 8 deaths. In rehab or detox, is rehab or detox enough? This is a very important statistic to kind of consider. 86 of the overdose deaths in the past 15 months were individuals who had achieved abstinence but later relapsed, which means that the community is doing somewhat of a good job getting people into initial forms of treatment, but getting them from the initial treatment to sustained abstinence is really the focus that is a major area of focus that we need to look at. And then finally, a really important statistic that Svi mentioned, which is that 82% of the people that are in treatment and remission, from all the numbers that we've described, have family support, which means families that are supportive of addicts have a much better chance of those individuals seeking treatment and then achieving the remission that we all want. So if we talk about education, I really felt like it was important to give everybody a little bit of a snapshot of the different layers and types of interventions that exist, because people get all these things confused. You might call one program that provides one layer of intervention and get confused why another program is not dealing with an issue and it's really dealing with a different layer of intervention. So we have prevention, treatment, and 12-step recovery groups. Those are kind of the 3 main types of treatment intervention. Prevention, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but it includes education, mentoring, criminal justice reform, and crisis support and referral. Treatment includes a litany of process, which can include psychotherapy, intensive outpatient, intensive inpatient, detox, step-down programs, supportive housing, recovery supports, and then finally we have 12-step recovery programs. And as a member of the community, I'm happy to report that we have a very wonderful, active 12-step community that runs under the table that nobody even knows about. There's actually 2 sheets on the table over there that 2 members of our community, both from living young adults who have families, made up, by young adults I mean young family men, who are active members, one of NA and one of AA, decided that they wanted to put together a list of the local meetings in AA and in NA that are available in this area, and that's on that sheet. So what you have is an army of people in this community that are actively willing to help people that need help, be it from the organizations, and then once the person is willing to get help and go to meetings, there's an army of from people that are ready to help and be of support. And that doesn't just exist in the 5 towns, it exists in Flatbush, in Crown Heights, in Muncie, and in Lakewood. Finally, let's kind of take a look at the whole picture, summarize the whole deal. So chronic substance abuse leads to heavier, more illicit drug use and dependency. And dependency and illicit drug use leads to addiction. And a predisposition to addiction or trauma can trigger this whole process. All of this can result in emotional and cognitive impairment, dangerous risk-taking, like driving under the influence or other risk-taking behavior, legal trouble, and God forbid, the thing that we're most scared of is overdose and death. So what can we do about it? So if I had to think about the most significant stumbling block that stops us as a community and us as individuals from helping addicts, or those of us who are addicts helping ourselves, I would say the biggest stumbling block is denial. And denial is a maladaptive pattern of thinking that feeds and facilitates abuse, dependency, and addiction. Denial is a human reaction to dealing with situations we don't want to deal with. But when it comes to abuse, dependency, and addiction, it's a very, very dangerous, very human reaction. And denial manifests itself in 2 forms. The first form is, I got this. Not seeing or admitting to the problem. Well, he's not really an addict, or he does not really abusing, he's just having fun. Isn't he just a teenager? He's just experimenting 5 or 6 times a week. The other form of denial is manipulation of self or others. And that's when the individual knows that there's a problem, but they're desperately terrified to face the problem, to think about the consequences of what looking at the problem and admitting the problem would be. And this manifests not only in addicts, but also very significantly in their families, who have to consider what their neighbors might think, what what the consequences of there are, or even just facing the reality that their child or family member is an addict. So I wanted to give you some pointers for communication. The most important thing is to create an environment that encourages honesty. If you want to help an addict, you have to make sure that they're not engaged in active manipulation. Dialogue is good. You don't have to agree, and they don't have to like it. Sometimes you have to tell an addict like it is, whether they like it or not. And sometimes you have to repeat it ad nauseum. And many times an addict gets help because somebody who loves them tells them enough times, I know that you're not okay, and you know that you're not okay. And as soon as you're ready to admit that to yourself, I'm here to help you. Allow for mistakes. Set benchmarks to establish a baseline. This is obviously I'm not talking about someone who's actively addicted to heroin or some other kind of acutely dangerous drug. But if a family member is engaging in unhealthy behavior, substance abuse, for example, sometimes it takes asking them a question like this. Okay, I understand that you're not ready to get help, but what would it take for you to be willing to admit that you have a problem? Is it an issue at work? Is it getting in the way of your schoolwork? Now, when I'm not talking about overtly dangerous drugs, and I'm not talking about children. I'm talking about adults who have autonomy, who do whatever they want, who are engaged in behavior they're concerned about. Many times, it's the most helpful thing you can do is be that healthy and objective voice to them, kind of setting that baseline so that when they cross that line, they have the opportunity to have a rock bottom experience, which is a moment of clarity. Consequences are opportunities for them to learn, not for you to win. I think one of the biggest mistakes that parents and families make is that an addict finally has a rock bottom experience and they can't wait to jump all over it and finally be right. And what that does is that it sends the addict back into his denial, back into his place of self-protection, and it can really ruin the opportunity. And it's critically important to remember that. What happens when a problem comes up? The first thing you want to do is start with identifying what you see. Identify the scope of the problem. You can ask yourself, using the framework we talked about tonight, am I looking at substance abuse? Am I looking at dependency? Am I perhaps looking at addiction? Does this person display some of the other things that we described today? Differentiate between crisis and concern. It's critically important. When you're engaging an addict or somebody who's abusing substances, who needs help, if you present something as crisis, that's a concern. He'll know that you're lying. If you present something as concern, that's a crisis. He'll know that he or she, I shouldn't say he or she will know that you're lying. It's very important to be very clear about those two things. The next thing is somewhat related, and this is a super important one, which is differentiating between disapproval and what's unacceptable. Many times when we love addicts, there's something that they're doing, not addicts or people that are substance abusers. There are things that they're doing that we really disapprove of, and we present it as if it's unacceptable. And when we do so, we present ourselves as unreasonable, and we shut them down, and we make it impossible for them to come and ask us for help. So it's critically important that we're very straightforward and we differentiate between those two things. Finally, the most important thing is never get in the ring with an addict. I counsel people all the time in my private work, parents in particular, to remember that when it comes to manipulation, an addict's like Mike Tyson, and if you step in the ring with Mike Tyson, he's going to knock you out. There's no question about it. Thinking that you're going to outthink an addict and get him to raise his bottom and to manipulate him to think that he has a problem or to create a consequence that's not real, you'll always lose. The most important thing when you deal with an addict is to be very straightforward, in their face, very subtle, and very clear, because they can't get around that. The worst thing for an addict is to be straightforward. Keys for loved ones. Stick to your guns. Let them know they're not made of Teflon. One of the most dangerous things in the life of an addict, this is existent in adolescents in particular, but we're not just talking about adolescents tonight, is that they think they're made of Teflon. They think they're going to get away with it. They think it's not going to happen to them. Just like us, sometimes we don't want to see that something's going to happen to us. It's part of the denial manifestation. It's critical that if you set a consequence, that if you set a boundary, that you stick to that. But if you overplayed or underplayed your card, never be scared to admit it, and always be willing to start over again. You're never locked into any position. So if you think that something's going on and you made a certain agreement with somebody, or you set a certain baseline and you realize that you made a mistake, or you got counseling that made it clear that you made a mistake, you don't owe them to stick to what you said if it's because you made a mistake. It's important to give yourself that out. Never ignore, but sometimes allow the process to play out, obviously in non-life-threatening situations. Sometimes you have to let addicts learn for themselves. You have to let them experience some of the consequences of their behavior before they're willing to get help. Sometimes families run the tendency of kind of like forcing somebody to get treatment when they're just about there. And the family has a tendency to kind of push them forward further than they're ready. And what happens is you end up wasting resources, and you end up wasting opportunity because the addict spends its entire time in treatment fighting with the fact that he doesn't really have a problem. Now, these situations are very challenging. You'll see in a moment what I'm going to suggest is that anyone who has an addict in their life needs to seek consultation. You need to get help and you need to get support so that you can make the right decisions. Never facilitate. It's never appropriate to facilitate the use of anyone else. It's never appropriate to let your kids, if you were talking about a child, use in your house. To do anything that directly allows them to use. Enabling, though, is a different thing. Enabling is a very, it's a dirty word in the addiction world, but it's very challenging to completely not enable somebody. So I always try to tell people to avoid enabling. But specifically, and I define enabling as anything which indirectly makes use or abuse possible or protects the addict from natural consequences. And it's critically important that we try to avoid that. Seek guidance. The healthy and effective response always requires a balanced approach. I've seen this again and again. If you take an approach that's too severe, it's not going to work. If you take an approach that's balanced and healthy, you have a better chance of success. Doing so always requires support. And finally, also doing so requires seeking support for yourself. Living with an addict or having a family member that's in active substance abuse or addiction is terribly troubling. It can bring about feelings of resentment and fear that can cause a person to do all sorts of things that get in the way of successful and effective responses. So it's critically important that you not only get consultation and advice, but also that you seek the support you need in order to make sure that you're in tip-top shape to deal with the family member. I want to just say that I'm super grateful to have had the opportunity to be here, and I hope the information was useful. And I wanted to echo what Rebecca had said: is that if we can even have the strong sense that we've saved one person today, which I have no doubt that we're going to save hundreds of people today with all of the different things that we did today, then I'm very comforted. This morning when I was working on I'm speaking off the cuff now. This morning when I was working on the presentation, it became aware to me that tonight, and yesterday were the yahrzeit of two individuals from our community that died last year. And one I was rather close to. And I was nervous to come up here because I was scared that I was going to start crying because I'm a little bit of a crier. And it was very moving to me. And it's moving for me because it's wonderful to see that the community is acknowledging the problem as real, and it's wonderful to see that we're banding together to deal with the issue and help save our children and our community members. Thank you so much.